America's debt is one of the biggest threats to the whole world right now. Moody's, the credit rating agency, has dropped their rating of America's creditworthiness for the first time in over 100 years. The big, beautiful spending bill has just passed the House and it's going on to the Senate. Trades and tariff talk put U.S. Treasury bond rates on display. Is America's debt going to destroy the global economy? We're going to look at this and more on today's Trumpet World. America is addicted to debt, but I've been hearing stories about how catastrophically huge America's government debt is pretty much for as long as I can remember hearing anything on the news. So I'm joined by our U.S. correspondent, Andrew Miiller. Andrew, why should we worry about this now?
I think the important thing now that is actually causing people outside the Trump editorial department, people like Warren Buffett, Ray Dalio, even some former members of Barack Obama's budgetary team, to sound the warning is really the debt to GDP ratio. It's the ratio that's the important thing now, because like you said, for as long as you can remember, or at least for as long as I can remember, we've had a multi-trillion-dollar debt, and it's been getting higher each year. So for years, those with a little bit of foresight should have been able to see that this is a problem coming down the road. You can't keep spending beyond your means forever. Now we're actually getting to the point where the debt itself, it's about 37 trillion. And that's definitely a scary number just because a trillion's a big number. But the important thing to focus on is that 37 trillion is 125% of GDP. So our debt's actually bigger than our economy.
So at this point, if America dedicated everything that it produced for an entire year, all goods, all services, and all of that was dedicated towards paying off the debt, it still wouldn't pay America's debt off.
Right. You'd only pay off about 4/5 of it in that case, which is concerning because the bigger your debt to GDP ratio is, because you owe interest on the debt, and so the bigger that debt to GDP ratio is, the more of your budget goes to interest payments. Right now, I think it's roughly 20% of all tax revenue goes to interest. So when you pay taxes, 1 out of every 5 tax dollars you pay is just interest on the debt America already has. And because America keeps running, it looks like this year it's going to be a $2 trillion deficit, that debt to GDP ratio goes up. That percent of the budget that goes to tax revenue keeps going up, to where now the Congressional Budget Office is telling us that assuming Treasury bond rates stay below 4.6% for the next couple decades, which probably won't happen, by the year 2044, that's less than 20 years away, America's going to be in a place where they basically have to borrow for all government spending. Like the taxes you pay will just pay for interest. America would go bankrupt before it reaches that point. But that's why I think Warren Buffett he just recently, in one of his last shareholder meetings, was saying that America needs to get its budget deficit down below 3%. I think he chose that number because the U.S. economy grows at roughly 3% a year. So if the economy grows at 3% and your budget deficit's 3%, your debt to GDP ratio stays constant. But if the budget deficit's not below 3% and it's currently at about 7%, then this point where basically all tax revenue is just going towards Social Security and interest will come even sooner, and the government will be bankrupt. That's why Moody's downgraded the United States from a triple A to a double A rated economy because they just know that, like, well, your long-term plan is not a solvent plan.
So you've talked a fair bit about Doge over the last 6 months or so, and that has kind of been Donald Trump's biggest solution, at least one in the, say, the election, that we're going to come in, we're going to strip out the fact there's a huge amount of wastage in Washington, and we'll be able to balance the budget and get the deficit under control without having to make cuts that affect American citizens. Is Doge the answer? Is that going to... Do we not have to worry about the extra giveaways and things in the big, beautiful bill because Doge is going to get things back in line?
Doge is part of the answer, but it's far, far, far from the entire answer. Donald Trump's only been in office roughly 4 months, and this new big, beautiful spending bill, Doge has cut about $160 billion in non-defense, non-entitlement spending, which is pretty good progress for 4 months, I'd say. I've actually been pretty pleased with the progress Doge has made, just trimming wasteful spending and making the government just more efficient. Now, the the problem with the big beautiful budget bill is that even though Doge cut 160 billion in non-defense, non-entitlement spending, the bill raised defense spending by about 116 billion. It added about 34 billion for border control. Social Security cost went up some, and it extended the tax cuts. So in total, the big beautiful spending bill added about $300 to $400 billion in additional deficit. So we spent all the money Doge saved us, and then about that much over again, which is highlighting an important struggle America's having in its budget balancing quest. Is you've got what I've heard referred to as like the three sacred cows of the budget, the three things that no politician's willing to do, or no Congress, maybe certain politicians are, but no Congress is willing to do. The first one is reform entitlement spending, like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. All the politicians are like, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid are off the table. They've shown no willing to cut defense spending. That's the second sacred cow. And they've shown no willingness to raise taxes. And so just mathematically speaking, if you don't raise taxes, if you don't cut defense, and you don't cut Social Security, Medicare, or Medicaid, even if Doge cut everything else and spent $0 on everything except the military, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, you'd still run about $120 billion deficit or somewhere in there.
So if America continues business as usual, I think under the big, beautiful spending bill, the deficit would be about 7% a year. There is no way the U.S. economy is going to grow by 7% over the next year. So that deficit is just going to keep on going up and up, even compared to the size of the U.S. economy. So what happens? What happens if we continue with that status quo?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And eventually you'll go bankrupt. That was the Warren Buffett's comment, as he said, if something can't go on forever, it will stop. That's just common sense. Now, there's quite a bit of debate over at what debt to GDP ratio does the economy collapse. I think even the most liberal economists today say that your economy it couldn't take a 200% debt to GDP ratio.
And that's, I
Which,
guess
according
that's
to
Japan. But, it's one thing for Japan to have a 200% government debt, but they're also the world's largest creditor rate nation, as well as being the world's largest debtor. They've got some weird kind of dynamics going on from their long-term deflation. But when you're talking about the United States, you're talking about the biggest player in the global economy as well, which gives America exorbitant privilege, as it's been called, but also means that they maybe can't get away with some things that others could.
Right, yeah. Well, the fact that the dollar's the reserve currency has helped us kick the can down the road a little bit, just because we can borrow money at 4.6% or whatever I think that's what the 10-year Treasury yield is right now. I didn't check it this morning. It goes up and down a little bit. So we can borrow money at a pretty low interest rate. But again, as rating agencies keep moving down your credit rating, those interest rates go up. If 10-year Treasury yields were as high as they were under Carter in the 70s, we'd be bankrupt already. There's no way we could finance a $37 trillion debt off the interest rates we paid in the 70s. Because it's low, Warren Buffett's comments was that he's like, if we don't get the deficit below 3%, we're going to go bankrupt. He's like, maybe it will happen in 2 years, maybe it will happen in 20 years. He's like, I don't know, but it will happen. We've run, our debt. Our deficit's been higher than our economic growth for well over a decade, and there seems to be no sign of that slowing down. I think, actually, I wrote an article a few years ago called "Can America Afford Its Military?" And it focused in on some comments that Niall Ferguson had made about nations often falling apart when the cost of the interest on their debt exceeds their defense budget, which we were at that point. We might not actually be anymore now that Trump's increased the defense budget, but we're right kind of at that tipping point. And that's not a financial equation saying that, like, oh, well, you go bankrupt when you do this. It's more of an equation that as the interest on the national debt gets bigger in the years to come, and you finally have to kill one of those sacred cows. People probably aren't going to get rid of Social Security. It's probably going to be the military that's caught. And so that's probably one of the next signs you'll look for as America's path towards bankruptcy is start shuttering overseas military bases. Okinawa, some of these other like far-flung places, as you just try to like pare down your military. That was Niall Ferguson's point with that equation. It's not that like, oh, well, if your defense budget is less than your interest payments, you go bankruptcy. It's more like, no, if your interest payments are more than your defense budget, then you can't afford your defense budget, and you're not going to be a global superpower for much longer. You're going to start scaling back your overseas commitments in order to pay those interest payments.
Okay, so we don't know exactly when this kind of point of unaffordability is going to be reached. But what happens when America does hit that point? And you mentioned scaling back. Like right now, we can kind of debate, should America have military bases in Europe or in Okinawa and this kind of thing. There will become a point where there won't be any debate. America just won't be able to afford these. But kind of what else happens when that point is hit? What does that look like? Because I know Donald Trump, at least judging by comments he made during his first term, which may not reflect his current beliefs, but he said, oh, well, it doesn't really matter if you can't pay your debts back. You renegotiate. I renegotiate all the time. You say, well, when you're not getting $100 back, you're getting $60. He doesn't seem to think that, or at least he didn't seem to think that that's too big of a deal. So what happens when America reaches the point where its debt is unaffordable?
Yeah, well, preferably you start making the spending cuts before you hit that point. But like I said, if you do hit the point where you can't start paying your interest payments back, and then you do like Donald Trump was saying in his first term about starting to negotiate for lower terms, you're basically in the national equivalent of bankruptcy at that point. And Donald Trump may be right that in that point, some of America's creditors may be very happy to accept half their money back as opposed to getting nothing. But if you thought the downgrade from a AAA to a AA economy was bad, when you start not paying creditors bad, it's like your credit rating goes down to basically like junk bond
Right, that's a
status.
default.
Yeah. And when the junk bond status comes up, your interest rates are going to spike very high, which is then it's going to be like a negative feedback loop where now your interest payments are so high that your interest payments on the national debt go again that you can't afford to pay that either. Uh, and you eventually just get to a point where you've basically declared bankruptcy, and no one is going to lend you money anymore. Or if they do, it's going to be at an exorbitant interest rate. And so the era of cheap free money, or not free, but the era of cheap money will be over. And so going forward from that, America will no longer be able to finance these huge deficits with money borrowed at a low interest rate. They'll basically be forced to either balance their budget so that we don't need to borrow money from anybody, um, increase taxes so that we don't have a deficit that way, or start printing money.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in just a second because that is kind of an alternative to the hey, you're only getting $60 for every 100 back. That's a different a different way of dealing with it. But on this point of okay, you're just getting a fraction of your money back. I mean, this really does seem like a nightmare scenario to me, kind of when you think about it, because as you laid out, you have a US government that cannot spend as it is now, that can't borrow money effectively and can only spend the money it's able to raise in taxes. At the same time, you're looking at the collapse of every major pension fund. Like if the government, who's loaning money to the government and now suddenly not getting a chunk of that back? It's hedge funds, it's banks. A lot of that is pensions because US Treasury bonds have typically been seen as a safe asset. I mean, you're looking at the biggest sweep of bankruptcy since 1929, if not even further. So you're looking at private pensions vanishing. You're looking at mass unemployment as companies go under, at the same time as you have a government that cannot afford to give unemployment benefit, that cannot afford to give Medicare and Medicaid, that has promised, hey, I'm going to take your money in Social Security, I'm going to look after that money for you, and then I'm going to give you your money back as a pension, but then doesn't have any money to give back at a pension and can't borrow any money as a, like, I mean, this seems beyond economic crisis and more like people starving to death type territory if you go down all the way to the logical conclusion of what a kind of a hard default could look like there, right?
Yeah, those are all extremely likely options. I mean, you look at you talk about the America's reserve currency status as as a extraordinary privilege because it allows you to borrow money cheaply. It's basically like a very low interest credit card. Then you get to a default situation where you lose that privilege, and you can no longer afford the interest rates to borrow money, and you're forced. to either slash spending, raise taxes, or start printing money, there have been definitely historical precedents for that. And usually you're looking at like Robert Mugabe's Venezuela or Weimar Germany or
Right. So I mean,
Venezuela
maybe I'll
now.
just introduce this more fully, and then you could go on with what you were saying, because that's the other way of dealing with this, the one that's a little more, say, underhand or less upfront, and that is you print money and you use that to pay the debt off. So you're still, if somebody's owed $100, they're still getting $100 back, but because the government controls the printer, those $100 are not worth it. They're not worth as much as they used to be. So that isn't a default. That avoids America kind of losing its credit rating in that massive way. And I think also it's something to a degree that is almost forced to happen, because at this point, like you said, if interest rates go to where they were under Jimmy Carter, the government goes bankrupt. I mean, at the end of the day, that means the Federal Reserve can't raise interest rates to control inflation in the way that it has done in the past. It is limited now in how much it can keep inflation under control because of American borrowing. So kind of America does seem like it's heading down this path where inflation is used to reduce the American debt. Okay, we can't grow the economy by 7 or 8% each year, but if we inflate the dollar by 7 or 8% each year, we can shrink the debt that way. But you were just talking about the consequences then of going down that route.
Yeah, and I think that's actually probably, if I had to guess, the most likely route America would take, just based off past behavior. You look at how America dealt with the 2008 financial crisis. You look with how America dealt with the 2020 COVID lockdowns. In both cases, there was a lot of quantitative easing. I think at one point it might still be true that like one in every $5 in circulation was put into circulation since the COVID pandemic. And so, because if your options are cut spending, raise taxes, or print money, because you can't borrow anymore because you're not creditworthy. If you were willing to cut spending, if you had the political will to cut spending, you should be doing that now before we get to this nightmare situation. So it doesn't seem like America has that political will. So in which case you'd be raise taxes, which they've also shown themselves not to have the political will to do. It seems like printing money is the second easiest option, as opposed to borrowing it. So if you get cut off at the borrowing source and can no longer afford to borrow, I think America would probably just start printing. It's what other nations historically have done when they get in that bad situation. But then you get cases like, you look at societies that have done this. You've got Robert Mugabe's Venezuela, to where the amount of money that you could have used to have bought a house in 2000 would have bought you a banana in 2008. Or Weimar Germany, where you're papering walls with Deutschmarks or Reichsmarks, whichever it was, because it's literally cheaper. The paper in the mark is cheaper than the paper in the wallpaper. So yeah, you don't want to buy wallpaper because the wallpaper is worth more than the money is.
And this is where I think this is worth talking about on Trumpet World. This show focused on the world, because when Zimbabwe did hyperinflation, it was terrible and catastrophic for Zimbabweans. If America does this, this is terrible for the world. I talked about the consequences of America just saying, okay, we're not paying back all of our debts. Whether you have that or whether you have an America that says that really inflates the currency, that's bad for everybody. Because dollars denominate the global trading system, any large business holds lots of dollars. Any large pension fund whether they're in Germany or France or Britain or in New York, they're going to hold a lot of dollars. So if you devalue the dollar or devalue US Treasury bonds, because a lot of these dollars are going to be held in Treasury bonds, you're hurting everyone. So what you could see this doing is, this will be a global financial crisis. And at this point, it basically seems like America, the car is speeding to the wall. There's an opportunity now to pump the brakes. That's not being taken. We still don't know exactly, is America going to accelerate all the way until it smashes into the wall and it's going to be absolutely catastrophic? Are they going to pump the brakes and it will still be too late? They're going to hit the wall, but not as high a speed. There's still those things that we don't know. But you can see that a crisis is coming, and you can see that this crisis is going to affect the world, that you're going to have people all over the world potentially losing their pensions, businesses going bankrupt all over the world, banks going bankrupt. You saw in Cyprus where you had banks going bankrupt and the government solving that problem by dipping into money and savings accounts, and you had people losing their entire pension. I mean, if you're, I don't think you and me would have been affected by what happened in Cyprus if you're just kind of an ordinary employee. But if you're small businesses, easily had more than 100,000 euros or 200,000 euros, however much it was in the bank account, they lost out. You had pensioners. If you're going to be if you're planning on living on your savings for the next 30 years, you're going to need a lot more than 200,000 euros in your bank account. Suddenly people found that getting wiped out. You're looking at something that America's greed and America's inability to fix this problem. I mean, sure, yeah, other people, France, Britain, Italy, there's a lot of other countries in bad financial shape. But because the global financial system is built on the dollar, it's the problem in America that seems now inevitably set to cause a crisis for everyone.
Right, and it's not a coincidence that World War II followed the Great Depression, because you're looking at, just for historical parallel, like the Great Depression, which was largely made in America but became a global thing, also played a huge role in the rise of Nazism in Germany and the rise of fascism in Italy. And just creating the conditions that eventually ended in a world war. From a prophetic standpoint, Mr. Armstrong, Herbert A. Armstrong, often said they thought that it would be a financial crisis in America that prompted European nations to unite into a superpower, as great or greater than either the United States or Soviet Russia, and then leading to World War III.
So I do have a clip that we can play. This is from his World Tomorrow program in 1984, where he says exactly that.
The present economic crisis threatens the very existence of the United States of America. Now, that statement ought to be thundered in banner headlines filling the whole upper half of the front pages of newspapers and also thundered out in newscasts. But this crisis, the financial crisis, is more serious than the world understands. It not only concerns the United States and Latin America, it is a world economic crisis. I was in London recently at the time of the economic summit of the most powerful nations. And I had meetings there with some of the heads of government. And I can tell you that they were even holding back a lot of the seriousness of the economic situation at this present time. What is happening can suddenly force a unification in Europe, a United States of Europe, that will produce a new world power, a world power colossus, perhaps larger than either the Soviet Union or the United States, and formed for the very purpose of destroying the United States of America. And that very fact is foretold in your Bible in the prophecies of the Bible, believe it or not.
So that's exactly what you were saying, and that's exactly what you can see this building to. This is going to cause a major financial crisis for Europe. You could see your potential again, a lot of hardship. Will it get so bad, this financial crisis, that you could even have famine or people struggling just to eat? And you could see how if America's irresponsibility causes that around the globe, the crisis causes Europe to unite, to come together as this world power in a way that they've taken significant steps to, but they haven't managed to go all the way to. I think the fact that they haven't done it already after the 2008 financial crisis, after COVID, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I think that shows you that it will take something pretty big to shake them up. It'll take a major crisis to do that, but you can see how that can lead to that power and lead to them being very angry with the United States. And it's a power that will then very swiftly, take what I guess it might see as vengeance on the United States. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to play that. I did interrupt you, but you referenced Mr. Armstrong. That was him saying exactly that.
Yeah, our editor-in-chief, Mr. Gerald Fleury, has called that, pretty much that clip you just played, Herbert Armstrong's greatest personal prophecy. A personal prophecy being a prophecy that's not explicitly word for word in the Bible, but is based as like a second-tier prophecy on those prophecies that are. Because we definitely have like first-tier Bible prophecies in Revelation 17 about 10 nations surrendering their power to a central authority in Europe, and then other prophecies in Isaiah and Hosea, and probably like 100 prophecies total throughout the Bible about that power invading America. So the idea of a United States of Europe invading the United States is all throughout Bible prophecy. The Bible doesn't necessarily give the full details on what prompts this United States of Europe to form. But just based on events on the ground, Mr. Armstrong said he strongly felt that it would be a financial crisis in America that was the catalyst that kind of had this power form. And it's interesting today because if you look at world reserve currencies, like 60%, you mentioned earlier, like 60-something% of currency reserves are in dollars, making the dollar the preeminent reserve currency. But the number 2 reserve currency is the euro at like 20%. And then all the other ones are like down like single digits. So the euro is definitely the world's number 2 currency, and probably the only currency that could replace the dollar as the reserve currency. The Chinese yuan has other problems. But the main Achilles heel of the euro right now, showing that why it's not taking up more than 20%, is the fact that unlike Washington, D.C., the euro is not backed by a federal government. It's backed by a central bank, but it's got 17 different governments. So in order to get a stable enough currency to replace the dollar, these Eurozone nations are going to have to surrender a lot of their monetary authority over to a central power, and just years of language differences and culture differences and historical differences. They've been unwilling to do that, but a financial crisis in the United States that brings about like Great Depression style conditions would definitely be a jolt to actually get these European nations to surrender their financial authority to a central body in a way that Bible prophecy indicates will happen. So like I said, yeah, the Bible prophecy about the 10 nations in Europe invading America is sure. And then Mr. Armstrong's prediction that it would be a financial crisis that causes these 10 nations to form definitely looks like events are heading that way.
Yeah, you can really see that forecast for Mr. Fleury happening before your eyes. And I think one final thing that I thought was interesting in this same World Tomorrow program. And he did talk about the cause. And this is what he had to say about that.
There's something more than just making money. But making money has been the whole thing in this world. When we live the way of get, that means get money, because money is the medium of exchange used in everything people want to get. It all gets back to money, and money is involved in the whole banking structure. So when we come to a banking crisis, a financial crisis, you're getting down to the crisis of the way we live and the very root of people. That's why, my friends, that the love of money is the root of all evil, and that is a law. It is the root of all evil. The other way, of course, would be generosity and love and cooperation and helping. There isn't much of that in this world. Not much of that in the world. All world troubles and all of our nuclear fears and the fear of blowing up the whole world of the war, it comes over possession of goods and things and the power of controlling areas of this earth and the wealth that comes out of the earth. That is what is back of everything, and that's why this financial crisis is such a crisis, and it's a thing that people have not understood and they have not realized.
But he brought it back to cause and effect, and that it is getting and selfishness, and he went right back and talked about, well, there's two ways of life, give and get, and it's this way of get that is causing this disaster. And like I said, that's not unique to the United States. The United States problems uniquely affect the rest of the world, in which, say, someone like Italy, that's also massively in debt, isn't going to echo around the world in the same way. But these problems are being caused by that get philosophy, and all of our finance is built on that get philosophy. However, he also talked about where this is leading. And this is leading to ultimately, the rise of this European empire, a massive, not just economic, military crisis for the world, huge amounts of destruction, but then this.
And that's the sign of Jesus Christ in the heavens. And then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they, the people on the earth, shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. He's coming to end this world that is built on the get philosophy, built on competition and strife and violence and warfare and of unsolvable problems and troubles harming so many human lives. And then will come the second coming of Christ and a happy and a peaceful world tomorrow.
It's leading to Jesus Christ getting involved in world events and ending the philosophy, the way of life, the get way of life that caused all of this, and bringing the give way of life and a sound economic system to the whole world.